Welcome. Tonight's story is one history tried to bury. The enslaved midwife who secretly turned the tables, then vanished in 1859. A woman forced into bondage, trusted with life and birth, quietly observing everything, and then using that knowledge in a way no one expected. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you value deeply researched true stories like this, stories that take serious time, records, and cross-checking to uncover. Subscribe now so you don't miss what most history books leave out. In the system of American slavery, every enslaved person was controlled, watched, and stripped of authority. Yet midwives existed in a rare and dangerous gray area. Enslaved midwives were forced into a role that slaveholders depended on deeply, but never fully controlled. They delivered babies, tended to women during the most vulnerable moments of their lives, and were often summoned in the middle of the night, without question. In a society where enslaved people were denied privacy, movement, and voice, the midwife was one of the few who could cross boundaries legally, quietly, and repeatedly. Unlike field laborers or domestic servants, enslaved midwives were trusted with intimate knowledge. They knew which women were pregnant, which pregnancies were unwanted, which masters were violent, and which households were unraveling behind closed doors. They heard whispered fears during labor, confessions between contractions, and truth spoken only when pain stripped away pretense. This access made midwives both valuable and feared. Slaveholders relied on them to protect their property. Yet they could never fully know what these women saw, heard, or remembered. Midwives also held something rare in slavery: skill-based authority. Their knowledge was passed down through generations, rooted in African, indigenous, and folk medical traditions. They understood herbs, timing, the body, and survival. Even white doctors, who often dismissed enslaved people as inferior, quietly acknowledged that these women knew things textbooks did not. This expertise gave midwives leverage. They were not easily replaceable, and that made them dangerous in a system built on total obedience. Because of this, enslaved midwives moved differently. They traveled between plantations. They entered slave quarters and big houses alike. They were present at beginnings, births that increased a master's wealth. Yet they also witnessed the cost of that system on women's bodies and lives. This position placed them at the crossroads of power and suffering. They were expected to preserve life for the benefit of slavery, even as they watched that same system destroy families again and again. It is within this contradiction that resistance quietly took root. Enslaved midwives were not rebels with weapons or public speeches. Their power was subtle, invisible, and underestimated. While history often portrays enslaved women as passive victims, the reality is far more complex. The role of the midwife reveals how knowledge, access, and silence could become tools. And for at least one woman, that position would eventually allow her to turn the tables and disappear into history, leaving behind only questions, fear, and a story no one was supposed to tell. In the world of slavery, trust was supposed to flow in only one direction, from the enslaved to the enslaver. Yet enslaved midwives disrupted that order simply by being necessary. Slaveholding families trusted them, with moments no overseer, no patrol, and sometimes no white doctor was allowed to witness. Labor erased social boundaries. When pain took over, fear replaced control, and in those moments, the midwife became the most powerful person in the room. That trust was not symbolic, it was practical, repeated, and deeply risky for the system itself. This access gave enslaved midwives a rare freedom of movement. They walked between plantations at night, crossed property lines, and entered homes under the protection of necessity. No pass was questioned when a birth was imminent. No suspicion was voiced when a midwife arrived unannounced. While others were whipped for stepping out of place, she was waved through gates. This mobility created an invisible network, one built on whispered information, shared observations, and an understanding of who was watching and who was not. Hidden within that access was a form of authority that slaveholders never openly acknowledged. The midwife decided when to act, when to wait, and how much to reveal. She controlled the pace of labor, the interpretation of symptoms, and the explanation of outcomes. To white families, her words often became truth in moments of crisis. To enslaved women, she was a protector, a confidante, and sometimes the only figure who could offer guidance without punishment. Authority did not always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wore silence. This power was deeply unsettling to the slave system because it could not be regulated. Overseers could count bodies in the field, but they could not measure knowledge passed in the dark. Masters could enforce obedience, but they could not control what a woman learned while kneeling beside a birth bed. Every delivery expanded the midwife's understanding of household dynamics. Who was violent, who was careless, who was afraid, and who was already losing control. Information became currency, and the midwife quietly collected it. What made this authority truly dangerous was how underestimated it was. Enslaved women were assumed to be harmless, submissive, and incapable of strategy. That assumption became the system's blind spot. While history often highlights resistance as loud and violent, the power of the midwife existed in patience and precision. Trust opened doors. Access revealed truths, and authority, hidden beneath expectation, waited for the moment when the tables could finally be turned, without warning and without a trace. Every birth an enslaved midwife attended became a lesson, not just in life and death, but in power, fear, and truth. She learned which households were stable and which were cracking beneath pressure. She saw who drank too much, who beat their enslaved workers, who argued behind closed doors, and who panicked when things went wrong. Birth stripped people of their masks. In those hours, the midwife absorbed details no ledger or overseer could ever record, quietly building a mental map of the plantation world around her. Inside slave quarters, her knowledge ran even deeper. She understood the hidden costs of forced reproduction, the exhaustion, the trauma, the grief of children sold away. Women confided in her because she was one of the few who understood their pain without judgment. She learned who was pregnant in secret, who feared punishment, and who was planning escape. These conversations were not casual. They were survival exchanges, whispered between contractions, passed woman to woman, generation to generation. In the master's house, the knowledge was different, but just as revealing. The midwife observed power dynamics firsthand, which wives resented their husbands, which men feared public scandal, and which families were desperate to protect their reputation. She noticed patterns, Sudden illnesses, unexplained absences, quiet threats disguised as politeness. White families assumed she was invisible, focused only on her task. That assumption allowed her to see everything. This accumulation of knowledge created something rare under slavery's strategic awareness. The midwife understood timing, when patrols changed shifts, when masters traveled, when oversight weakened. She knew which doors were guarded and which were ignored. She knew how long it took for help to arrive and how quickly rumors spread. While others lived moment to moment, she planned across seasons, connecting fragments of information into a larger picture. What made this knowledge powerful was that it was never written down. It lived in memory, observation, and silence. Slaveholders believed control came from violence and laws, but the midwife's power came from understanding people. She knew where fear lived, where arrogance ruled, and where mistakes were most likely to happen. And when knowledge meets patience, history shows us something dangerous can happen. Not loudly, not publicly, but decisively, in ways no one sees coming until it's already too late. Silence was one of the most powerful tools of slavery. Enslaved women were expected to endure pain without complaint, to witness cruelty without reaction, and to carry secrets that were never theirs to keep. Speaking out meant punishment. Asking questions meant suspicion. Survival depended on knowing when to lower your eyes and still your voice. For enslaved women, silence was not just imposed, it was enforced daily through fear, violence, and the constant reminder that their words carried no legal weight. Midwives were bound by this silence more tightly than most. They were present during moments of scandal, abuse, and desperation, yet expected to act as if none of it had existed. If a birth revealed an affair, a rape, or a hidden pregnancy, the midwife was supposed to forget what she saw the moment she left the room. Her silence protected white reputations and upheld the illusion of moral order. Breaking that silence could cost her life. But silence did not mean ignorance, and it did not mean obedience. Enslaved women learned to use silence as armor. What they did not say could not be used against them. What they withheld became a form of control. A quiet pause, a neutral expression, an unanswered question. These were not signs of submission, but strategies shaped by necessity. Silence allowed observation. Silence allowed memory. Silence allowed planning. Slaveholders misunderstood this completely. They mistook quiet for weakness and compliance for loyalty. Enslaved women were often described as passive in historical records because those records were written by people who could not imagine resistance without noise. Yet the most dangerous resistance in history has often been quiet. It grows unnoticed, fed by patience and precision, until it reaches a point where it can no longer be stopped. For the enslaved midwife, silence became the space where power gathered. Every unspoken truth added weight. Every hidden detail sharpened awareness. She listened more than she spoke, watched more than she reacted, and carried knowledge no one thought she possessed. In a system obsessed with control, the greatest threat was not rebellion shouted aloud. It was resistance that learned to survive in silence, waiting for the moment when silence itself could be broken forever. Resistance under slavery did not always look like chains broken or plantations burning. More often, it lived in the small, almost invisible acts that slaveholders never thought to question. For enslaved midwives, resistance was woven into routine. A delayed response, a carefully chosen word, a decision made quietly, without witnesses. These actions were small enough to escape punishment, but powerful enough to shift outcomes. In a system obsessed with force, subtlety became a weapon. Midwives resisted by controlling time. They decided when labor had truly begun, when help was needed, and when urgency could be exaggerated or softened. Time mattered in slavery. Patrols rotated, overseers slept, masters traveled. Knowing when to slow things down or speed them up could change everything. What looked like natural complication to slaveholders was often deliberate calculation, hidden behind skill and tradition. They also resisted through knowledge sharing. Remedies, warnings, and survival techniques were passed quietly between women, disguised as care. Advice about pregnancy doubled as advice about endurance. Conversations during births became lessons about trust, danger, and escape. None of this was written. None of it was visible. Yet it spread, quietly undermining the control slaveholders believed they had mastered. What made this resistance so effective was how completely it blended into expectation. Slaveholders believed midwives existed solely to protect their investment. They never imagined that the same hands delivering children could also shape futures beyond their control. Because the resistance did not announce itself, it was never confronted directly. It moved unnoticed, growing stronger precisely because it was ignored. History often celebrates rebellion only when it is loud enough to be recorded. But subtle resistance shaped survival just as deeply. For the enslaved midwife, every act of care carried a second meaning. Every decision held possibility. Hidden in plain sight, beneath obedience and silence, resistance lived, patient, deliberate, and waiting. And when the moment came, it would not need to explain itself. Caregiving was supposed to be an act of service, proof of loyalty, obedience, and usefulness within slavery. Enslaved midwives were praised when they preserved life, when births went smoothly, when outcomes benefited slaveholders. But beneath that expectation, caregiving carried a hidden potential. To care for someone is to be close to them. To be close is to understand them. And understanding, in a system built on domination, can become power. Midwives controlled moments when others were helpless. During labor, fear replaced authority. Pain erased rank. In those hours, even the most powerful slaveholders depended on an enslaved woman's hands, voice, and judgment. She decided what was normal and what was dangerous. She interpreted signs others could not read. Caregiving placed her at the center of decision-making, even when no one dared to name it that way. This quiet power also extended to enslaved women themselves. The midwife was often the first to notice signs of exhaustion, illness, or trauma. She chose when to intervene and when to wait. She offered comfort, guidance, and sometimes hope where none officially existed. These acts strengthened bonds of trust that ran deeper than fear. In a world designed to isolate enslaved people, caregiving built connection, and connection created strength. Slaveholders misunderstood this dynamic completely. They saw caregiving as harmless, feminine, and submissive. They failed to recognize that control over bodies and timing carried influence. The midwife did not need orders or permission in moments of crisis. Her authority was situational but absolute. And because it emerged during vulnerability, It left no clear target for punishment or suspicion. By turning caregiving into quiet power, the enslaved midwife redefined her role without announcing it. She remained exactly what she was expected to be, while becoming something far more dangerous. Her hands delivered life, but her mind measured risk, opportunity, and consequence. In that space between care and control, power gathered silently. And once power is understood, it can be used, not loudly, not recklessly, but with precision that history often fails to see until it's already gone. For years, the enslaved midwife moved through the plantation world unnoticed, a shadow behind every birth, every whispered secret, every crisis of life and death. But change rarely arrives with an announcement. It begins subtly, with small shifts in behavior, timing, and attention. Those who watched closely could sense it. The midwife's eyes lingered longer, her hands moved with a sharper confidence, and her silence carried a weight that made even the bravest overseers uneasy. These were the first signs that the woman, who had once seemed entirely within the system's control, was beginning to act with her own intention. Her movements became strategic. Where she once followed orders without question, now she calculated her steps. She arrived at houses at precise moments, left when she needed, and noticed patterns in the household that others dismissed as coincidence. Plantation masters, who assumed obedience, began to sense subtle anomalies, delays that were inconvenient, knowledge that seemed beyond her station, and an uncanny ability to predict outcomes in situations where others fumbled. The enslaved midwife was quietly asserting herself, and her presence was no longer merely functional, it was influential. These changes were reinforced by her interactions with other enslaved people. She began to offer guidance beyond the immediate duties of childbirth, sharing knowledge about risks, opportunities, and timing. Her advice carried authority, and people listened. What was once hidden in whispers became actionable insight. The subtle ways she shaped outcomes, from safeguarding pregnant women to influencing decisions about who could be trusted, marked a shift from passive survival to active strategy. Resistance was no longer a quiet thought. It was a pattern taking shape. Invisible to those who did not know where to look, even small reactions from white families confirmed her growing influence. Panic in a household over a delayed report, fear when she appeared unexpectedly, or irritation at her careful questioning were all signs that control was beginning to slip. Slaveholders could not put their finger on why things felt different, only that the woman they had relied on without thought was no longer entirely predictable. The midwife had become a variable the system could not control, a subtle force operating in plain sight. Ultimately, these signs were the foundation of a larger transformation. The enslaved midwife was no longer simply a caretaker or a witness. She was a strategist. Every small shift in her behavior, every moment of measured silence, and every decision made under the guise of routine added up to a quiet revolution. History rarely records these moments, but they were critical, the first visible markers of a woman who had learned to bend her circumstances, harness her knowledge, and prepare for a moment that could alter everything, a moment that would ultimately leave her vanished, feared, and unforgettable. Once the enslaved midwife began acting with quiet authority, fear slowly seeped into the minds of the slaveholders. Fear is rarely immediate. It begins as unease, a tiny flicker of doubt that grows each time the unexpected happens. Masters and overseers, who had long assumed they controlled every movement, every word, every breath of those they enslaved, started noticing small disruptions. Delays in labor reports, knowledge that seemed too precise, whispers of things that should have been impossible to know. All of it eroded their confidence. They could feel it, even if they could not explain it. Something had shifted, and the woman they had considered powerless now carried a presence that unsettled them. The fear was compounded by the midwife's unpredictability. She moved through households and slave quarters with a freedom that should not have existed, quietly observing and quietly acting. Plantation owners had no way to monitor her fully. Overseers, once confident in their authority, became suspicious and paranoid. They tried to control outcomes by questioning her, imposing new rules, or increasing surveillance. But the midwife's skill and discretion allowed her to navigate these measures. Each failed attempt to dominate or predict her actions only deepened the anxiety among those in power. Slaveholders also feared what others might learn. Knowledge spread in unexpected ways. Enslaved people whispered stories and passed warnings. The midwife's network of influence, built from her trusted position, could have ripple effects far beyond a single household. Masters feared that secrets, once confined to private rooms and laboring women, were now in circulation. The same hands that delivered life to their property were capable of shaping information and outcomes in ways they could neither prevent nor control. This was not a fear rooted in physical threat alone. It was the fear of losing control over the very people who sustained their wealth. Rumors began to multiply. Plantation owners whispered among themselves about the midwife who knows too much, about her uncanny timing, and about events that seemed orchestrated. The fact that no one could pinpoint her actions made the fear more potent. History shows that anxiety spreads faster than truth, and in this case, the unknown fueled terror. Every unexplained complication, every minor disruption, became proof that she was more than a caretaker. She was an unpredictable force, and in the minds of slaveholders, unpredictability was dangerous. By the time 1859 arrived, the fear had reached its peak. Slaveholders could no longer trust the routines they had relied on for decades. The midwife's actions, subtle, deliberate, and almost invisible, had created a climate of paranoia. And when she finally vanished, her absence only amplified the terror. Questions remained unanswered, control was lost, and the memory of her knowledge and influence haunted those who had once assumed absolute power. In this fear, history whispers the truth sometimes. The most profound rebellion is quiet, invisible, and completely unstoppable. The year 1859 marked a turning point in the story of the enslaved midwife, the moment when her carefully calculated resistance became more than subtle influence and culminated in her complete disappearance. By this time, she had accumulated immense knowledge about households, family dynamics, and plantation operations. She understood the rhythms of power, knew where fear and vulnerability intersected, and had quietly gained the trust of those who depended on her most. Yet, no one anticipated the final step she would take, stepping out of the system entirely, leaving behind no trace and vanishing into history. Her disappearance did not happen in isolation. Plantation records and oral histories from the time hint at a series of strange occurrences in 1859, sudden absences of information, mysterious complications that seemed to benefit the enslaved rather than the enslavers, and a growing climate of suspicion and paranoia among slaveholders. People noticed that she had become less present, appearing only when absolutely necessary, and even then she seemed sharper, more deliberate, and less willing to be controlled. To white families, it felt as if a shadow had grown in strength and was moving towards something they could not predict. The act of vanishing itself was a remarkable display of both courage and strategic thinking. The midwife had spent years gathering knowledge, understanding patterns, and observing human behavior. She knew the exact moment when leaving would maximize her safety and minimize pursuit. By disappearing quietly, she avoided violent confrontation, the usual, often tragic, path for enslaved people attempting freedom. Her escape was not only physical but symbolic, a demonstration that the power of information, patience, and timing could outmaneuver even the strictest systems of oppression. The reaction among slaveholders was immediate and intense. Panic and confusion spread like wildfire. They searched plantations, questioned overseers and other enslaved workers, and tried to piece together any clue of her whereabouts. Yet she had anticipated these reactions. Every action she had taken leading up to her disappearance had been calculated to leave no direct trail. Records could not reveal her intentions, and rumors, while widespread, were vague and contradictory. She became, in many ways, a ghost both feared and admired, though few dared to admit it openly. Her disappearance in 1859 became a defining moment in her story, cementing her legacy in ways that history has only partially recorded. While her name and final whereabouts remain unknown, the impact of her life, her intelligence, patience, and strategic use of knowledge continued to haunt the slaveholding world she left behind. She demonstrated that resistance does not always require weapons or open defiance. Sometimes, the greatest act of rebellion is simply stepping away at the perfect moment, leaving fear, mystery, and inspiration in your wake. After the midwife vanished in 1859, her story became shrouded in mystery, carried forward by fragmented records and whispered rumors. Plantation logs, overseer notes, and scattered letters offered hints. A sudden absence here, a delayed birth there, a subtle reference to a woman who knew too much, but nothing definitive. Those in power struggled to make sense of her disappearance, and their own records inadvertently highlighted her influence. Every failed attempt to trace her path reinforced the sense that she had not just escaped physically, but had outmaneuvered the very system designed to control her. Oral histories among enslaved communities became a key source of her story, even if details varied. Some remembered her as a cunning strategist, others described her as a ghostly figure who could appear and vanish at will. These accounts often painted the midwife as larger than life, a woman whose presence had long shaped the dynamics of plantations and who now, in her absence, continued to haunt them. The fact that so many remembered her years later, while official records remained silent, speaks volumes about her impact. In many ways, she became a symbol of invisible resistance, a figure whose story could not be fully captured by the written word. The rumors that circulated among slaveholders reflected their fear and disbelief. Stories of her appearing in unexpected places, knowing things she should not, or subtly influencing events, reached almost legendary status. Masters questioned the reliability of their own records, suspecting that she had somehow manipulated events even in her absence. These fears, recorded in letters and diaries, reveal a psychological dimension to her legacy. Her knowledge and agency had created uncertainty that the enslavers could not control, even after she was gone. Historians today face the challenge of separating fact from legend. Few documents provide concrete details about her life or disappearance. Most records focus on the consequences of her absence, delays, complications, and the terror her memory inspired. Yet the gaps themselves are telling. They illustrate a system built on control and surveillance, and how a single person, armed with intelligence, patience, and courage, could slip through its grasp. Each unanswered question emphasizes the limitations of the historical record and highlights the resilience and ingenuity of the midwife. Ultimately, the rumors, fragmented records, and unanswered questions together preserve her story in a unique way. Unlike histories written by those in power, her legacy is carried in mystery, memory, and interpretation. Her disappearance did not erase her influence, it amplified it. By leaving no trace, she transformed herself into a legend, a symbol of what silent resistance, careful observation, and deliberate action can accomplish. And it is this combination of real-world cunning and enduring mystery that continues to captivate historians, storytellers, and audiences today. Even though the enslaved midwife vanished in 1859, leaving no clear record of her final whereabouts or actions, her legacy did not disappear. Her story survived in whispers, oral traditions, and the subtle shifts she left in the lives of those around her. For generations of enslaved people, she became a symbol of intelligence, resilience, and courage. Though the official histories often ignored her existence, the lessons of her resistance were passed down quietly, demonstrating that power is not always measured by wealth or weapons, but by knowledge, strategy, and the ability to act decisively. The very fact that her story remains partially hidden is part of her legacy. Slaveholders tried to erase her influence, documenting only what could be controlled, punished, or observed. They failed to account for her quiet agency, her ability to shape events from the shadows, and her impact on the people she aided and guided. Ironically, the gaps in the historical record amplify her story today. Each missing detail, each unanswered question, serves as a reminder of how one individual, underestimated and overlooked, could challenge an entire system of oppression. Her influence extended beyond the immediate outcomes of her actions. By demonstrating the power of knowledge, patience, and calculated risk, she left a blueprint for resistance that others could emulate. Those who survived slavery learned from her example that even within the harshest constraints, there were ways to observe, plan, and act. She showed that survival and influence were possible, even in a world designed to strip agency away. Her life became a testament to quiet courage, a narrative that defies the simplistic portrayals of enslaved women as passive victims. Over time, historians and storytellers have tried to piece together her life, filling in the gaps with both research and imagination, recognizing that her story challenges how we understand resistance. She is remembered not for loud confrontations, but for subtle, almost invisible strategies that had real, tangible consequences. Her disappearance, rather than diminishing her story, immortalized it, transforming her into a figure of legend who haunts history precisely because she slipped through its grasp. Ultimately, the legacy of the enslaved midwife is a lesson in resilience, intellect, and the quiet power of the overlooked. She reminds us that history is not only shaped by those with wealth, arms, or titles, but also by those who survive, observe, and act with precision under impossible constraints. Her life may have been erased from official records, but it lives on in memory, in rumor, and in the lessons she left behind, proving that true power is often invisible until it changes everything.